Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hey, welcome to Nightlight. Glad you're here with us. I just want to say happy birthday to Jerry Ann and Mommy. Hey, don't forget the Mothman Festival is this weekend at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And tomorrow, please join us with a new show. Barbara is starting with Mary Joyce, and I will be on from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern. For the Nightlight Part 2 shows, this is basically a variety show, but the emphasis is on exploring hidden or lesser-known aspects of history. And there are two conferences coming up. AAPS is October 4th through the 6th, and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is October 17th to the 20th. And we want to let the audience know about these conferences, hopefully attend them, or just listen and learn something different. Our first guest is Dr. Steve Spyrison. He is a dentist and has had a lifelong fascination with Atlantis, Mu, and the ancient cultures of the Middle East. He has contributed articles to Ancient American Magazine. He will be presenting at the AAPS conference. That's the Ancient Artifact Preservation Society. His website is infinitypeace.com. So I just want to say, welcome, Steve. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, cool. Well, glad you're with us. When you do your presentation next month, you'll be discussing Atlantis and Mu. These are fascinating subjects. A lot of theories about them. But the first documented piece of literature about Atlantis comes from Plato. He's a venerable person from antiquity. Is not presented as a extreme alternative historian that there are a dime a dozen today. But I think we need to take a look at this story behind the story. What?
Right.
This such an esteemed person from prehistory seems to be depicting something that was really there. We aren't seeing it today. where did he learn this information about Atlantis, and what was he being taught?
Yeah, no, this is an excellent starting point because this came from Socrates, who was the teacher. Plato was the student, and both of them they were philosophers. They were seeking the truths in the world. So this wasn't. They were not creating whimsical fictional stories. They wanted to document what they felt was truth. So where did Socrates and Plato get this? Well, that goes back 100 years before either of them were living, and that was a historical figure in Greece. He was a senator by the name of Solon. He was a senator and also a poet, and he was a very well respected senator. And but he got involved in some legislation that was very good, very needed. But some people don't like changes, so he started receiving some threats and some death threats. So his other senators said, "Hey, Solon, we like what you did, and we're not going to change anything. But for your own safety, why don't you just take a sabbatical for a few years till things cool down?" So he traveled to Egypt, which would have been on good relations with Greece at that time. And then when he was there, he heard about an elder priest who could read the hieroglyphs on the columns at Karnak. Now, Karnak was then, and it still is, the largest columnar temple in the world. Columnar temple meaning that it's just composed of these gigantic columns, and there's hieroglyphs all along most of them. So and this priest said there was this story of these ancient sea people, the Atlanteans, and they had carved this story into stone, and which so the priest he said this is our history, it's not a fable. And Solon was able to go to Karnak with the priest. The priest told him the story, and the priest was glad to do this because in the final days, the Atlanteans were instead of wanting to trade with the world, they were wanting to conquer the world, and they were as they were approaching to Egypt. All the other countries had fallen, and Egypt was about to fall, but the Greeks came to their aid in the last second and last moments, and they were able to help repel the Atlanteans. So the Egyptians always were thankful to the Greeks for helping them, even though there was after the giant cataclysm of Atlantis exploding, most surface life in the Europe and Africa was wiped out. But prior to that, the Greeks had helped. So that was the story that Solon had gotten, and so after a few years he was able to get back to Greece, and then when he was back in Greece, he told small groups of friends many times about this story. And very often when he was telling the story, his grandson would listen. And years later, after Solon had passed and the grandson was an adult, and when Socrates was an adult and Plato was a child or a young person, Plato and Socrates heard the story from Solon's grandson. So the whole thread line of this story is two kids. Solon gets the story from the priest who reads it from the columns at Karnak. Mm-hmm. Solon's grandson hears it. Solon's grandson tells Socrates and Plato. After Socrates dies, then Plato then writes his dialogues, and all the dialogues are named after an individual who does most of the talking. And so there we have the Timaeus and the Critias that talked about the founding of Atlantis that Solon had learned, and also the end days. So interesting, and a very the story about the founding of Atlantis is is in the middle of a larger chapter where they're talking about the whole history of the universe, and Atlantis is just one part of that. The Atlantis description is just five pages inside of a bigger chapter. So they, and it tells about Poseidon. So yeah.
And Steve, since we're talking about a Mediterranean setting for the exchange of information about Atlantis, do you see Atlantis being located where Santorini is? The island of Santorini is now located, or do you see it outside of the Mediterranean, towards in the Atlantic Ocean?
Kind of probably roughly, the Plato's description gives the exact size and stadia, which is the Greek measurement, and it was probably somewhat bigger than the state of Illinois. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. I think one of the outposts or outer islands might have been touching our in the vicinity of like the Bahama Islands. That would have been like the northwest of the island. So,
okay, yeah.
And then that's just our best estimate. We know that Plato's description described it as beyond the gates of Hercules, which were Gibraltar. So it was west of that, and which would put it in the Atlantic.
Okay. Well, yeah, there are a number of theories of where all the concentric rings were located, and it's just interesting to get various points of view. And it seems like it was a very literate society, and the Sea of Reeds seems to have survived as a symbol of the literature that was produced on the island. And you also get the 12 emerald tablets. That's an extension of this mystery as well. How did these emerald tablets fit into all the stories? Are they mentioned on the hieroglyphs at Karnak, or how are they introduced into this story?
Well, the emerald tablets of Thoth the Atlantean is what Thoth is claiming to be one of the last remaining priest kings from Atlantis. Actually, his dad was one of the kings. He was basically the son or a prince during the final moments, and they were not living on and that's a whole nother story. There was dissension there on the main island. Probably the peacekeeping leaders had been exiled, self-exiled or politically exiled, to a separate island that was walled, and no one could go on to the island or go from one half to the other half, and that's where Thoth had lived. And then in the final days, various of the priests were able to fly or to travel to different parts of the world and settled in Mayan area and Samaria and Tibet. And Thoth went to the land of the Chem or Egypt, and he claimed that he created the Egyptian civilization, that he educated them, and he built the Great Pyramid. Was an energy transducing device to prolong his life. So yeah, he claims that that he wrote that in the Atlantean language, and that there was a translator who said that he was able to read that, and then he has translated into recent publication. So, but yeah, he and those claims that he created the pyramid for his purpose. And when you look at the pyramid, well, they say, oh, well, it was a tomb for one of the pharaohs. Well, what they call a sarcophagus that was in the king's room, it was too big to have come through any of the hallways. It was the purpose for which the pyramid was built. The pyramid was built around this so-called sarcophagus, and that's entirely consistent with Thoth said. It was not meant to house a dead body. This was a positioning device where he put it in a central part of the pyramid where it would collect the energies from the pyramid. And the very word pyramid refers to this. It's Greek, but pyr means fire or energy. Amid means within. So it's referring to the energy that the pyramids are built on every single continent on this world. I don't know if you're familiar with this, a contractor built a pyramid in Gurnee, Illinois, and he had strange things happen. We can't get into all the details, but he could not buy an unripe banana because it would never ripen. Just had strange effects on. Thoth claimed that he used that to rejuvenate his body, and the so-called sarcophagus, it was simply a positioning device. He placed that in a specific position inside the king's chamber, so that it would hit him probably in the pineal gland. And since then, in modern, they've moved the sarcophagus. It's not where it used to be, so we don't know where it had originally been. So, yeah.
Steve, I've read a little bit about this energy plant theory, and there seems to be some other kind of soot other than from a torch being taken down those passageways.
There's no soot. There's no soot, and there's no light in there. And if you go, once you get to a certain point, there's no air in there. A candle or a torch wouldn't stay lit because there's not enough air in there. So they had to have had. I mean, unless they were just walking by pure intuition, they had to have an electronic lighting system or some crystal source of light to get in there, because there is no soot. There's no evidence of any fire having been in there
there's like
very interesting.
There's some other kind of I use the word soot, might have been the wrong for like a residue of some other chemicals on the ceiling. It just sounds like there was something else going on inside the pyramid of Cheops than just housing some body. It's
right.
It's really an intriguing subject. I have to expand on that in another show, but
yeah.
But so we have these energy plants.
Can I? Okay. Well, yeah. You take this however you want to, whatever direction you want to take.
Okay. So,
I could. Yeah.
Okay. So Atlantis is out in the Atlantic Ocean. You get advanced technology, energy plant thing being constructed in Egypt. And you mentioned, some of these outposts. I've read a little bit about, these outpost theories. Like in Spain, you get like the Basque language, and Barbara and Greg Little did a show on. Covered some of the Bimini Road information. It just seems like all around the what's now the Atlantic shoreline that there are what could be interpreted as these outposts. Can you explain a little bit about that, and how do these outposts relate to North America and the Native Americans and all of your information that you'll be presenting at the Ancient Artifact Preservation Society?
Yeah, exactly. When the Spanish, when they were conquering the Canary Islands, they were coming on an indigenous tribe and who worshipped a god very similar to Poseidon, and they were tall. They were like 6-7 foot tall. They were very robust, although fair-skinned and blue-eyed, so not typical natives that you would not a totally different race than the rest of Africa. So that had probably some Atlantean connections, and also Edgar Cayce in the 1930s. He said in 1968, not Atlantis proper, but an outpost of Atlantis would be discovered in 1968, and very specifically in 1968, that's when Bimini Road was found. And when you look at the images that come from this, you're seeing what looks like could be a road, except that the structure is not that long, and it ends as a J. Well, that's not a road. And so when they've done excavations of this, when you get to the edge of the so-called road and you keep going down, it's all stacked vertically. It's not a road, it's a wall. So that could, that's a possibility that could have been the island that Thoth had referred to as an outpost of Atlantis. And also when you look at word origins, that's another way of trying to figure out what's going on here. Bahama and Bimini, they don't relate to anything in English. They don't relate to anything in the Spanish language. They don't relate to the indigenous language that was Arawak, were the natives in, nor any other American indigenous language. So it had no origins. But if you take the word Bahamini, that is ancient Egyptian, and it means honor to the god Min, the god who protects those who travel far or to distant lands. So there you get your Egyptian connection. And you look at some of the pharaohs' mummies. They had traces of coca and nicotine in their tissues. So that has to come from the New World, and that's Atlantis was trading between the New World and to Europe and Africa and Egypt. So it just that kind of makes sense. So So yeah, there's just some interesting things, and then unfortunately we don't know as much about the Bimini Road as we could, because in the 1930s salvage ships were coming in, and they found all these nice free rectangular huge blocks, and they took thousands of them, and they took them to the Miami harbor. So probably portions of the potential outposts of Atlantis, they're sitting in the Miami harbor underwater, unfortunately. So they've been displaced. So yeah, there's that, and let me just briefly say that the Egyptians also confirm the Thoth story, because in their pharaonic dynasties, one of the earlier dynasties was Thutmose, a very ancient dynasty, and then later one of the more recent ones was Ramses. Well, Thutmose means Thoth, Moses, and Ramses means Ra, Moses. In Egyptian, Moses means in the lineage of. So Thutmose means in the lineage of Thoth, and that one comes first. And Ramses, a later god after Thoth, Ra, Moses, in the lineage of Ra. So the Egyptians refer to Thoth in their pharaonic dynasties. So that kind of confirms it's a confirmatory for the kind of confirms the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. So lots of links that are here. So
yeah. See, that's an interesting point. You know, it's when Barbara and I had Ahmed Osman on. He was presenting some of these, the pharaonic names and different interpretations, from Atlantis. But he's looking at like Tutmosis, it was the biblical Moses, and it's really interesting that, and now that you bring up this topic, that there's something behind the names, and in this case, it's always this Moses figure that's doing stuff like throwing a staff down, turns into snakes, and is involved with the burning bush and all that kind of stuff that is really supernatural. It's always like this same guy, that religious figure in Egypt, and it just he just seems like he just keeps reappearing in different connotations. There's just a power behind the name. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. You go to the word Moses. Well, that's not Jewish. Moses has nothing to do with the Jewish language. So here they name this guy after an Egyptian word, and in Egyptian it means in the lineage of, and that's kind of consistent with Moses. Moses was orphaned. They didn't know where he came from, but most likely Moses is a reference to Akhenaten. It's probably more the story of Akhenaten and Akhen, and that's a whole other topic. Akhenaten was Hathor, a totally different, almost a totally different race than the rest of the Egyptians. They had a long, narrow, tapering face, and his wife Nefertiti, She had the elongated skull. Yeah, and what did Akhenaten do? He changed their from the Amun priests who worship multiple gods. He tried to convert to the same as Judaism, to one God, the Aten, the sun. So and then the Amun priests got mad and they chased him out. They wanted to go back to the old ways. But so there's a lot of evidence that suggests that Moses really was the Akhenaten king. So yeah, very very interesting. But we could get sidetracked into that and try and get into the connection to King Tut and that. But
we'll just have to do another show. But
yes, absolutely.
The point is, you just can't ignore some of these names. It's like
they're significant.
Like what you're saying, like the Moses name, or like the Bahamas and Bimini. Those aren't colonial era English Spanish type names. They got so there's linguistic stuff that needs to be considered. But have you gotten into using the Google Earth to look at the ocean floors, and you get like the North Sea has a Doggerland, really shallow area where there was probably some kind of prehistoric crossing between the Netherlands and England.
There is a, and I don't know if this Google image exists anymore. I had made a copy of it maybe 10 years ago, and I can't find it in the current Google Earth anymore. But it showed it was just a Google Earth satellite radar image in the middle of the Atlantic, and it showed an obvious city type inhabitation just in the middle of the ocean. So there's those. Plus, you also have on the other side of the world, you have Yonaguni, which was a temple 200 feet, much deeper than Bimini Road, 200 feet under the water, just on the southern tip of Japan. And it's a temple with steps and statues, and there's alpha that we can see language on some relics that came from there. So probably, so it could easily relate to the earlier civilizations of Mu and Lemuria.
And that is based on excluding the possibility that the waves just happen to erode all these 90-degree angles in the form of a long flight of steps that go up to a perfectly flat platform area.
Yeah. When you look at the whole of the Yonaguni temple, when you look at it, you just know it's been humanly altered. They made hallways, stairways, they made statues, they made archways. So it's obviously not the raw stone anymore. It's been crafted once you look at the whole thing. So they're very interesting and very deep. Hard to explain at what point that was made, but it seems to imply it was a long time ago.
Is there any way to date Yonaguni to correspond with like Mu and the Pyramid of Cheops, and oh my gosh, can't forget to mention the Bosnian Pyramid. Maybe Barbara will chime in briefly if she's not if she's feeling like the bronchitis is allowing her to say something about her favorite topic. But there's like that possibility that all three of those places could be like super ancient. And it's Barbara had that one show with Dr. Sam on where
Sam Osmouch, yeah.
With
he's awesome.
There's that internal structure of the passageways going into the Bosnian pyramid, and it's like 25,000 years old. Do we have any dates on Yonaguni?
Oh yeah, the Bosnian pyramid is stated to be far older than the Egyptian pyramid. It's bigger, and the Egyptian pyramid is so accurate. It's like within one degree of perfectly aligned with north. But the Bosnian period, and this is a theme that we see all over the world, the more ancient the artifact, it seems to be more just more amazing in how it was constructed. It seems to be that they seem to be the more ancient, the more amazing and impossible they were. The Bosnian period appears to be far older. The Egyptian pyramid is within 1 degree of being of pure north. The Bosnian pyramid is within 0 degrees and like 1 minute and 12 seconds. So it's like 100 times more accurately aligned with true north even than the Egyptian one. And it wasn't made of stone. It's a form of concrete, and the density and strength of it far surpass anything that we're using today. It's just, and you referred to the tunnel system that's there. So the Bosnian pyramid appears to be far more ancient than the Egyptian one. And I suggest all of these things, including Stonehenge, all of these are far more ancient than what we commonly think. If you go back to the Sphinx, remember that 3,500 years ago, the Pharaoh they were doing restoration to the base of the Sphinx because it had severe water erosion around the base. So they were trying, and at that time they did the repairs, and that Pharaoh put up the dream stela in front of the Sphinx. So the Pharaoh had no idea who built the Sphinx. They were amazed by it, and they were preserving what they had, but they didn't know where it had come from. Same thing with Machu Picchu. You go to all the Western archaeologists. Oh, well, Machu Picchu was built 1,000 years ago. Well, go ask an Incan shaman. Did you guys build Machu Picchu 1,000 years ago? And they'll go, no, when we came here 1,000 years ago, Machu Picchu was here, and we have no idea who built it. It looked like it looked then 1,000 years ago, like it does today. So we're referring to civilizations that came and gone, and we don't have much information on them either. And then one more link is Easter Island, and I know you like talking about.
Oh yeah.
We get into the Moa, and they're situated. Most of the Moa are right on the outer periphery of the island, and a lot of them are facing outward. Well, the Rapa Nui, who are the natives on that, they say the statues are placed in honor of and in memory of their mother continent, which was Mu, and the eyes are looking upward because the Mu and Lemurians recognized that they had contact from star relatives that had aided their civilization, and just in the less than 10 years, we realized that those statues are not 10, 15 feet tall of just the chest and head. Now they've done excavations. They go, oh, actually these statues are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 feet tall. Okay, and they're buried up to their chests. So why would you make a 70-foot statue and then bury it in the ground? Well, they didn't bury them. They were silted in. And if you have any concept of the siltation process, it's very slow and it's very gradual. It pretty much implies that those statues were probably created in terms of perhaps 500,000 years ago. And that's entirely consistent with the endpoint of Mu, according to the mythology of that Mu pre-existed, then Lemuria was a daughter civilization of Mu. So yeah, there's lots of these ancient, these tidbits of information that give us a glimpse that this stuff is really, really old, much older than we've been taught.
Okay, so
very interesting.
And there are inscriptions on the Moai.
Yes.
Well, there's obviously just the statues themselves are remnants of some cultures' artwork. Maybe just direct connection to Lemuria. We have these samples of artwork. Maybe we touched on a little bit of the language. Probably in a few weeks when we have David Brody on, we'll probably touch on that information in more detail. But it just seems like we have in the Atlantic and in the Pacific remnants of these cultures. When you present this stuff at AAPS, you have a lot of people showing up who have open minds. How do the mainstream historians just deny all this evidence? It's right there. You can look at the science about the silt. I think when Dennis Stone was on with us, he talks about something like the scientific evidence shows that there's like inch of takes 100 years to make an inch of
silt, accumulation. It's probably less than that even. It's
decaying leaves
per year. Yeah.
The decaying leaves and pine needles, and it's a very slow process.
Right.
So, but the information's right there. There's science backing it up.
Yeah. mainstream science just ignores the stuff that they don't want because they have their favored theories and they protect them, and anything that doesn't align with their favorite theories, whether it's Darwinism or their timeline of how old these things are. If because part of my talk, I go into some really anachronistic artifacts, things that are way out of things, iron cups and brass bells and hollow spheres. They're embedded in coal. That's in the 400 to 500 year strata, or these hollow metal spheroids from silver mines in South Africa. They're embedded in like the 1+ billion year strata. It's very specific, and they're very human created. There's human footprints in limestone alongside dinosaur, and that's in 150 million year strata. So we have a lot of, and mainstream scientists won't touch that. These dinosaur and human tracks, you can go to Texas, in Biloxi, Texas. There they are. And there's a iron-headed hammer embedded in limestone. It's 150 million years old. How do you explain that? Not by Darwinism as we understand it, or archaeology and timelines that we have. It goes way beyond what we've been taught and told. But you can let me just put this in reference.
Sure.
Quick, because as long as we're going on this tangent, just remember the Earth is roughly 5 billion years old, right?
Okay.
And the much of the rest of our galaxy and much of the rest of the universe is up to 15 billion years old. So it is not a stretch of the imagination. The Earth is pretty new, 5 billion years. When we were first created, other life forms could have been from 10 billion, could have pre-existed us by 10 billion years. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that there is highly advanced civilizations that have been observing us from the moment we were created. And if they were observing us, they were visiting, they were making camps, they were having come and go civilizations. There would probably be artifacts, for almost as long as you could set foot on this planet. I mean, it would defy imagination to say that couldn't have happened. It's just far more likely that we've been observed and followed and intervened with for a long time. So just the more it seems like, and the ancient, the ancient artifacts, these are guys, the scientists who are trying to be truly scientific, that they want to be open-minded. They want to explore and talk about all the artifacts that mainstream scientists won't touch. So they're being far more scientific and open-minded. And I'm going to be stretching their scientific tolerance, because they want to stay hardcore archaeology, and I'm trying to introduce, just crack open the door and say, hey, we need to listen to what the indigenous people have to say, because the indigenous, everything we've talked about so far, Mark, the indigenous are saying, yeah, all that stuff happened. Lemuria was here, Mu was here, Atlantis was here. We've been visited by star relatives, and then all these other, the linguistics and the ages and accuracies of these ancient structures. They just don't jive with what we've been told by mainstream science and archaeology. So APS is they are trying to really open the door and look at this stuff that most scientists won't look at. So it's really a privilege to be part of that group.
Okay, and if you want to know more about this conference, you can go to their website, AAAPF.org. It's being held in the Island Resort Casino Convention Center in Harris, Michigan, October 4th, 5th, and 6th. I got, aside from Steve speaking, Rick Osmond, he's going to be a guest with us next Wednesday. Lon Krieger, he was I guess with us a couple times. We have Joan Conover, who is going to be our guest on October 1st. We're going to be covering these ancient canals in the Gulf of Mexico area. Lee Pennington is going to be up there, talking about the Brandenburg Stone. Ron Rademacher is going to be covering his Macintosh Stone. The hieroglyph. They were back to the hieroglyphs. We don't know what language was used for these. Put on these. This pebble, but it's like they were chiseled with such fine detail. It almost looks like they were carved by someone using a Dremel.
Yes.
I don't know how you explain it other than I don't know what kind of tiny equipment used to make so many detailed hieroglyphs on the size of a pebble that is a little bit larger than a quarter. Steve, what you've discussed so far, the speakers are just presenting things, that information that needs to be addressed, and what you're talking about with Easter Island, or Ron's Macintosh Stone. We don't know, but at least Judy's putting on this conference to get people to talk about things like this. What at a gathering like this with so many intriguing speakers, what do you think America needs to discover?
America?
Yeah.
Oh, well, my fondest dream, and I think the APPS conference echoes the same thing, is that all of these speakers, we need to be in schools as early as grade schools. The kids would love to hear this stuff, but we're just taboo. We need to be in schools talking about mythology and indigenous stories. We need to talk about Atlantis and Lemuria and ancient Greece and all these findings that mainstream scientists don't want to talk about. So it needs to be in the school. What the kids could do, the imaginations that we could spark by just presenting this to the young people, and getting them to understand some of these sacred geometric principles that are inscribed in these, spirals and Fibonacci sequence and sacred geometrics that are used at all of these archaeological sites all over the world. They all use a common language, and that's sacred geometry and basic principles of. So they knew a lot, and it's just such a shame that our young people are not getting exposed to this. So yeah, it'd be wonderful if we could just crack open that door. The thing is that stuff all over the world. Barbara had mentioned earlier that there was an ankh on the back of the Moa statue on Easter Island. We're seeing depictions of elephants that are, in some of the archaeological structures in South America. Well, South America didn't have elephants. They were from India and Asia. So if you had a giant continent in between India and South America, maybe Mu had elephants. And then it's not so illogical that South America could travel to Mu and they could see elephants. So then the world gets smaller, and things, how we talked about coca and nicotine getting traded with Egypt, even though it was a new world. If you had a continent in between, it makes it real easy. It just all explains why so many of these things, why there's so much, we see so many of the same depictions all over the world, even though this animal only existed in this part, but you see depictions of it in other parts of the world. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting pieces that fall into place once you, I think, as you explore different options, such as the existence of Atlantis and Lemuria, and some of those things. So yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating information. And has there been any unbiased DNA testing? And you just spoke about the mummies, but is there any DNA testing from Easter Island? I don't know if there was any burials there. I'm just kind of throwing something out. It seems like some of the Basque people have some different DNA, and I was just wondering, have you encountered any reports that show something different about if there was any burials from the Pacific that give us more credence for the Lemuria concept?
Well, maybe not. I suspect that there's a ton of evidence that scientists who've done genetic testing that they have found, but I don't think any of that has surfaced. If people do the Ancestry.com and they, oh yeah, I trace my ancestors back 10 generations or whatever, and they came from here and here. But the real question is, what star system did we come from? And some of the, and when you with the Basque, you refer to the Basque. Well, the Basque have a high percentage of Rh negative. Plus their language is totally unique. It doesn't track to any other language, and they have the highest percentage of Rh negative. Well, the Rh factor system, Rh positive means that your blood is similar to our closest mammalian relative, which is the rhesus monkey. Rh negative means it's not
Hello.
related. Hello,
Ramon.
are you there?
Yeah. Hey, Steve, finish your thought. I just got our next guest on.
We winding down?
Yeah. Yeah. We have about another minute.
Okay. Yeah. Just that the Bass were a totally different blood. Seemed to be a different genetic. So no, I think it has been a privilege to be on the show, Mark and Barbara. So thank you very much. And if anybody can have opportunity to go up to the APPS conference, it's up near Escanaba, Michigan. It's well worth the weekend. So hopefully we can get on in the future and talk some more about these things.
Okay, we'll do that, Steve. Thank you so much, and we're going to bring our next guest on. You just hang up. We'll get the archive to you tomorrow, and we'll stay in touch.
Okay. Thank you, Mark and Barbara, and all the listeners.
All right. Take care, Steve. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Good night.
Okay. We have our second hour guest. I didn't screw up the production of that one, so we will keep plugging along. Ramon Jimenez is returning to discuss the fascinating Shakespeare authorship controversy. Ramon was with us just about a year ago to discuss the release of his book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference. I think last year the book was so new that there wasn't even a press copy available at the time. But that's changed, and Shakespeare's Apprenticeship is an insightful, compelling book on this long-standing question about who wrote the Shakespearean plays that we all read to get through high school. And Ramon does an excellent job of making a convincing case that we've been attributing the world's most revered canon to the wrong person. Ramon has also been an advisor on several other books on this topic, like Catherine Children's Shakespeare Suppressed and Mark Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name. Both of those are also excellent books. And Ramon will also be presenting at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Hartford, Connecticut on October 17th through the 20th. And you can learn more about the conference by going to the Shakespeare oxfordfellowship.org. So welcome, Ramon. How are you? Thanks for returning.
I'm fine, thanks, Mark. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, we're just glad you're back, and this is just I just really enjoy this subject, and I'm glad I have a copy of your book, and your book focuses on 5 anonymous, unremarkable plays from the Elizabethan time period, when there were an overwhelming amount of plays written. But you claim that 5 of these plays are basically juvenile works from the person who wrote what we know as the Shakespearean plays. How did you learn about these 5 plays in particular?
Well, about 20 years ago, I came upon a short anonymous history play called The Famous Victories of Henry V. And reading it and rereading it, looking through it, I realized that this was the story that Shakespeare tells in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. And it looked to me as though this was a kind of shorter, cheaper, cruder version of that trilogy. And over the course of time, I found 4 other plays that seem to be in the same category. That is, early plays, the first versions of canonical plays with which we are very familiar. The True Tragedy of Richard III is Shakespeare's first version of Richard III. It has largely the same cast and roughly the same plot, ending with Richard being killed on the battlefield at Bosworth. Another one is The Troublesome Reign of John, and this is the same category, a play about the reign of John and all of his quarrels with the Pope and with the French king and with the barons and so on. And it's obviously an early version of King John that we see today. The fourth one is The Taming of a Shrew, nearly the same title as the play in the Shakespeare canon, roughly the same characters, roughly the same plot. And then the last one is a short romance called King Lear, which 30 years after he wrote that, he transformed that into the tragedy King Lear that we're familiar with today. So they are not only all early versions of Shakespeare plays, but they're all very similar to each other in their language and in the quality of their verse. And as you said, they are not top-rated plays. These are rather poor plays. They are not at the Shakespeare standard. But from the language and the characters, the dramatic devices, the plots, they are clearly Shakespeare's first versions.
Okay, Ramon, you just mentioned it's not the Shakespeare standard that we would expect, and you bring up early on in your book where there is the occasional comment about Shakespeare plagiarized these works. Like as other academics say, well, Shakespeare wrote this stuff, and it's just what came out of the off his little quill was perfect, as like the way Mozart or Beethoven wrote. It was just perfect. Hardly any revisions, and we have the masterpiece on the first draft, and get. You also bring up another point about other Shakespearean scholars are saying that he spent a lot of time revising these works until we get the the finished masterpiece that we all are reading in school. So you have like a variety of theories, and you were just mentioning Richard III. That's an example of you have a passage in your book about the opening soliloquy with Richard talking about he wasn't made for sportive tricks.
Right.
And that was something that appears in the this play that you're suggesting maybe the author was actually maybe 13, 14 years old, but it's showing up 30, 40 years later in like one of the all-time great villain as the hero type stories, Pattern for the Godfather. Can you tell us a little bit about that? This revision, just constantly working on getting these characters and phrases right over a long period of time.
Yes, Shakespeare, like a lot of our finest writers over history, was a compulsive writer. And he never stopped revising his plays. And this is very common among, let us say, the genius class of creator. It's true of Beethoven, it's true of Mozart, and it's true of Tolstoy, for instance. What I found, I think, are his first versions of these 5, actually 7 canonical plays. There are also, besides this early version, other versions of many of the plays. Some of the plays, such as Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, Othello, there are several versions of them, and scholars are even arguing now about the timelines for these versions. Something like 15 or so of Shakespeare's published plays say on the title page that he has revised and corrected them. So he was constantly doing this, and I'll give you one example. These early plays, they are very well plotted. That's been remarked by scholars about these plays. But the verse, the language, is not up to the Shakespeare standard, as I said. And here's one example. We all know the famous line at the end of Richard III, where Richard has been thrown to the ground in the Battle of Bosworth, and he shouts out, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." Mm-hmm. Well, the first version of that scene, the dialogue went, a horse, a fresh horse. So in his revision, Shakespeare added enough language to make the meter work, but not only that, he added another element to the line. That is, he would give his kingdom to have a horse, which was absent from the first line. That's just a short, simple example of how he improved the verse. And he did that throughout the play and throughout all the other plays.
And there you do cover the we say the Lord Grey as the prince's uncle, and he should have been considered Prince Edward's half brother, and that's a mistake on the writer's part. Can you explain that?
Well,
I thought that was you were going somewhere with that.
Yes, that's another example of the support or the proof that Shakespeare was the original author, and that he rewrote these plays, and they were his own plays. That is an error that has been noticed by scholars, and Shakespeare, in rewriting the play, repeated the error. And that occurs in almost every play. There is an example of that. I can't think of any others at the moment, but it's not uncommon. And also tiny details, tiny pieces of tiny phrases and language, geographic locations, things of that sort. They are repeated in the revised play, and that's just another example of the evidence for my claim that they belong to Shakespeare.
Another aspect of from Richard III that really caught my attention was the 13th Earl of Oxford was a primary supporter of Richard III's successor, and this would have been, if we're going to say that the real author of these plays was the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. He's writing about his great grandfather, something like several great grandfathers. But does that show an example of a youthful teenage boy, just kind of really taking pride in his family hair, really blowing up their importance when they really weren't as important as he thought?
Yes, it is. It's something that would be very likely done by a teenage boy writing about his ancestors, especially this teenage boy who had such prominent and well-known ancestors. In that play, Richard III, the 13th Earl was actual supporter of Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, and he was instrumental in Henry's successful invasion, and he led the vanguard at the Battle of Bosworth, helping to defeat Richard III. So he wasn't so much exaggerating in that play, but in the earlier play, in the famous Victories, he did exaggerate tremendously. He placed the 11th Earl of Oxford at the side of the future Henry V, whereas the 11th Earl of Oxford, although he was with Henry V in his army at Agincourt, This was 1415. He was not Henry's major confidant and right-hand man. The historical chronicles give that role to the Earl of Suffolk and also another earl. So he did exaggerate in that play. The 11th Earl is very prominent in the play. He speaks almost as much as some of the main characters, and he, of course, is the right-hand man for Henry Tudor. After the true tragedy of Richard III, he stopped doing that. And it may be that he matured a little bit and realized he shouldn't be doing this, or that he would be laughed at and so on. Also, it's quite possible that he was told by his guardian, William Cecil, and perhaps even by the Queen, that he was not to be revealed. He should not reveal himself as a playwright. It was not meet for a nobleman to write plays, and especially plays about the monarch and about English history. And so he may have been muffled, as it were, or muzzled. And Earls of Oxford do not appear in the Shakespeare canon except a couple of places where they have very short roles or a small number of lines. So that's a phenomenon of these plays that he gave up that practice.
That example you were just talking about, what was one aspect. I came away after reading your book about, we see the growth of the writer from these juvenile plays to being a mature writer. It's I think that's one of the aspects of your book that just brings something really fresh to this 400-year-old historical mystery. But the another aspect that I really thought was intriguing. What was from is also the from the true tragedy of Richard III that makes us have to reevaluate the traditional dating of these plays. And there was a line in there about the Queen Elizabeth. The Turk hath sworn never to lift his hand to wrong me, princess of this blessed land. And you're saying like a line like that, and we have letters from several other heads of state that are talking about congratulating her on ascending to the throne. But there are also some other examples where the could be interpreted as she survived having the smallpox in like what was it, like 1562 or some early early on in her reign. So that it's like those little small lines that you draw our attention to show us the need that, okay, there is some evidence there that makes us really need to consider that some of these very early plays date from the time period when De Vere might have been a teenager in the early 1560s. Does that correspond with his biography? And actually, Queen Elizabeth actually did have smallpox at that time.
Yes. There are a number of details in True Tragedy that point to the early 1560s.
Okay.
And one was her near death in the late summer of 1562. She was bedridden, and she was expected to die. And there is a reference to that in the epilogue to the True Tragedy of Richard III. This occurred just shortly before Oxford was transferred to William Cecil's house in London. Cecil, of course, was the principal secretary to the Queen, extremely close to her. And this event, this near-fatal illness would have been a subject of much concern and discussion in the Cecil household, and he alluded to it in his epilogue to that play. And these little details that tend to fix a date occur throughout these 5 plays. There are several in each play that tend to support the idea that they were written during the 1560s. And Oxford's biography supports these early dates. For instance, in The Troublesome Reign of John, I don't know if you've read that chapter, but that is a play about the reign of King John from 1199 to 1216. The play covers the whole range. He is being crowned in the first scene, and he's being poisoned in the last scene. In both plays, by the way, Troublesome Reign and King John. But the incident I'm speaking about is a fictional episode that he inserted in the first scene. And I don't know if you recall, but the first scene, John is being crowned in his court, or he has been crowned, and he's receiving the ambassadors from France. His mother is there, and his niece is there, and all of his court. Well, this celebration and this diplomatic meeting is interrupted by a sheriff who walks in and says he's got a problem. And his problem is the 3 members of the Falconbridge family are quarreling about who should inherit the lands and wealth of Robert Falconbridge Sr., who has just died. And the younger brother, Philip, is claiming that he should be the heir, not the older brother, because he was he actually is a child of his older brother Philip, Robert, is claiming that he should be the heir, and that Philip, the younger brother, is not the child of Falconbridge Sr., that he is an illegitimate child. Philip disagrees with this, of course, and says that's nothing to it. And the mother, of course, is outraged at this accusation. But it turns out that that is true, that Philip is the bastard son of King Richard I, who seduced Mrs. Falconbridge and gave birth to him, and so he is not the legitimate heir, and Robert is the actual heir. Finally, Lady Falconbridge admits to this, and Philip kind of pats himself on the chest and says, all right, I admit it. I'm a bastard. I'm a bastard of a king. What could be better? Anyway, he becomes the King John's right-hand man, and he essentially takes over the play. And he's portrayed in the most admirable terms. He is patriotic. He is clever. He is loyal. He is a diplomat. He is brave, etc. So, and this is all complete fiction. None of this happened. There was no Falconbridge family that intervened in John's court and so on. And this same fictional episode is attached to the canonical King John play. So the writer, Shakespeare, of King John, actually appropriated this episode. Now, the reason it's important is that the episode is practically a mirror image of what happened to Oxford at the age of 13. That is, he had a half-sister who was the child of his father's first wife. He, Edward, had a sister, Mary. They were children of Oxford's second wife. The half-sister, Catherine, accused Oxford of being illegitimate on the grounds that their father was still married to his first wife when he married his second wife, and therefore Mary and Edward were illegitimate. That meant that Edward was not only a bastard, but he lost his title, his earldom, and his wealth and his lands. Now, that was a formal accusation made to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we don't have a very good record or any record of what happened, except that he retained his earldom and his inheritance and so on. But it was a tremendous threat, as you can imagine, to the 17th Earl of being deprived of his personality, so to speak. He inserted this fictional episode into his play about King John. When he rewrote it more than 10 years later, he retained that fictional episode. So that connects the play pretty closely to 1563-64. Oxford also wrote a poem that we have that's extant, mourning the loss of his good name. That is, mourning the loss of his legitimacy and being declared a bastard. So it's a pretty clear connection between the play, the playwright, and the date. And it extends, as I said, on to the canonical Shakespeare play, King John.
Okay. Ramon, you were just covering this, the real author's autobiographical insertion of story into someone else's English history play. Okay, yeah, that's not the only time that was done. You cover that there was this robbery at Gad's Hill that is in the famous histories and reappears in the first Henry IV play. Yeah, you're saying that was an autobiographical episode as well. What's the story with this Gad's Hill robbery?
Well, that's a little less clear, and I don't think it's a reflection of his biography, but there was an incident later in his life when he was 23 or so, when there was such an incident. This was a fictional. Well, it was actually not fictional. It was based on some historical record that Prince Hal, before he became king, of course, he hung around with some low-grade characters, and he and they, the record indicates that he and they occasionally held up the king's receivers, the king's men who were carrying money from Canterbury or Rochester to London, and robbed them, and later returned the money. So Oxford put that incident into the famous victories of Henry V, his first play. Now, when he rewrote that play and created the Henriad, the Henry IV, Henry V trilogy, he carried over that incident, which he had created, and put it in the first part of Henry IV. He changed it a little bit so that it became a comical incident. That is, Poins, Ned Poins, who appears in both plays, by the way, with the same name. He and Prince Hal arrange with some of their fellow comics to rob the king's receivers, and Poins and Prince Hal let Falstaff and a couple of others do the robbing, and then they rob Falstaff and his friends of the money. And then they all have a conversation about it afterward when they go to the Eastcheap Tavern. So that is my understanding of this incident. It is based ultimately on stories about Prince Hal's actual behavior in the first decade of the 15th century, before he was king. Now, later in Oxford's life, when he was 23 or so, two I think they were William Cecil's men were robbed at Gad's Hill, which, by the way, was a favorite spot along the road from Rochester to London for holdups of that kind. It was famous for centuries for that kind of robbery taking place. Two of William Cecil's men were robbed, and they complained to Cecil about the robbery, and they said it was done by the Earl of Oxford's men, and that he had ordered it. Now, that's all the information we have. We don't know if that was true. We don't know what happened after that. We don't know why it happened. But many scholars have associated that incident with the incident in 1 Henry IV. But I think that Oxford created it himself certainly 10 years earlier than that. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's an interesting riddle, but as I say, I think Oxford based it on stories and tales about Prince Hal that had survived by then.
Well, Ramon, as you cover this, the Henry IV 1 and 2 plays, and or that leads into Henry V. This information, a little bit of the autobiographical material you just presented, as well as the revising of this trilogy. It is important to keep this kind of information in mind, because maybe about 20 years ago there was that Kenneth Branagh Henry V movie, and I guess that's just being it was just remade. Didn't that win like some kind of like Venice Film Festival award or something? So this part 3 of this trilogy is right there in the theaters today.
Oh yes. Yes. Well, it's a very popular play. Most critics don't think it's his best play, but Henry V and Richard III are probably his most popular history plays. And like all good stories, it is repeatedly remade, refilmed and redone. I saw the Olivier performance years ago, which was a great propaganda piece during the Second World War. And there are people who claim that Queen Elizabeth paid Oxford to write patriotic plays. I don't agree with that. I think he wrote them long before she got the idea, and they're not really patriotic plays. Most of the kings in his history plays are either murderers or are deposed or murdered themselves. They aren't really plays that support the monarchy, but it's an interesting theory.
Yeah, and you're just mentioning Sir Laurence Olivier's Henry V version. You also have the Monty Python guys doing some Richard III sections of a horse, my kingdom for a horse. These lines and characters had been are recycled throughout 19th or 20th century popular entertainment. So these characters never get old.
That's right. That's right. They're recreated. Each generation recreates them and repeats them and re-enjoys them.
Yeah. We have about 15 minutes left. Maybe a couple. You can give a couple quick answers, but your book does include really interesting chapter on the 2 King Lear plays. That was made into the Kurosawa movie ran. You know that. Yeah, that was a wonderful recreation in a Japanese samurai setting, and just fantastic how these ideas are just used by other cultures. But anyhow. In the first version of King Lear, spelled Leir, there are like 50, about 50 legal terms.
Oh, yes.
And do you want to explain it? I thought that was really another example where you make a convincing case that, okay, yeah, there is a little bit of autobiographical stuff there that can be claimed by De Vere, but not Shakespeare. So,
yes. These 5 plays, once one accepts the premise that they belong in the Shakespeare canon and they were written by the Earl of Oxford, they are obviously his earliest plays. Famous Victories is only half the length of an ordinary Shakespeare play. It's rather crude and clumsy. There are a lot of oaths, a lot of repetition. They gradually get better, but the 5 plays are not up to the Shakespeare standard, as I said. Now, looking at the language in each of them, you see, as you mentioned in King Lear, 50 legal terms, legal issues. And I'm not just talking about terms like judge, jury, and defendant, but complicated and serious legal terms. In the other 4, there aren't any. They do have an occasional judge and a divorce or some other reference to a legal matter, but they're essentially void of legal terms. All the other plays in the Shakespeare canon are full of legal terms and legal issues. It's well known that Shakespeare was well educated in the law. He knew it backwards and forwards, and he knew the language of the law especially, and he used it in his plays. So the point is that Oxford at age 16 entered Gray's Inn, one of the law schools in Elizabethan England. And he spent 2 or 3 years there. It was a residential program. It was actually only about a mile from where he was living in London at William Cecil's house. So it appears that it seems that you can assign 4 of the 5 anonymous plays to the period before he entered law school and learned the language of the law. And the 5th one, King Lear, and all the other plays in the canon are full of legal terms that he learned at Gray's Inn. One other example is Edmund Ironside, another anonymous play that belongs in the Shakespeare canon. And that's another play, a history play, takes place in the 11th century, and it is full of legal terms and legal issues. In fact, Eric Sams, the critic, said it sounded like all the characters had been to law school, and these were Saxons and Vikings. You know, they were not Tudor law students, which Oxford was. So that's just another detail that tends to confirm the date and the placement of these 5 plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just, and the Edmund Ironside. We'll have to have you come back and discuss on another show. Yeah, you've made some really compelling cases that we need to really evaluate.
And another example is the two shrew plays.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have time for me to talk about that.
We have about 9 minutes.
Okay, well, the first shrew play, Taming of a Shrew, Oxford wrote in his teenage, age 14 or 15. He set it in Athens. It was based on a Latin play by the playwright Plautus. He set it in Athens. The characters were Greek. There were Greek geography is mentioned throughout the play. And he rewrote that about 10 years later when he was in Italy. And my theory is that Oxford, as you know, traveled to Italy when he was almost 25. And he spent about, that's right, and he spent about 18 months in Europe, most of it in Italy. He established a household in Venice, and he traveled around the country, especially by boat, which was the easiest way to get around. Well, in November 1575, he was in Padua, and he wrote a letter from there to William Cecil about getting some more money for his trip, and we have the letter. So my theory is that when he got to Italy and he was exposed to Italian drama and to the Italian theater, which was much more advanced than the English theater, and he probably met some Italian playwrights. He saw some Italian plays. He decided he would set his next play in Italy, and then decided that rather than write a new play, he would revise one of his older plays and set it in Italy. And so he did. The Taming of the Shrew that we're familiar with is set in Padua. And one of our scholars, Richard Rowe, who traveled to Italy and did some research on these locations, found the actual place in Padua on the inner canal. That is the setting for the first scene in The Taming of the Shrew. But having transferred the play to Italy, he changed all the characters to Italians. And he brought in his knowledge of Italian customs and Italian geography and financial practices and so on. So it seems pretty clear that is the progression of his creation of these two plays. He wrote one at an early age based on a Latin model, and then when he got to Italy, rewrote it and just transported it and reconfigured it, transformed it into an Italian play, his first Italian play, and he went on to write 5 or 6 more Italian plays in the next 6 or 7 years.
Okay, cool. You know what? Want to have you back and go over this information in more detail. But you know, in the 5 minutes or so we have left, what will you be discussing at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Hartford?
Well, actually, I'm not going to be on the program on this year. I have been on most of them recently, but I'm skipping this one. But there are a number of other interesting speakers, and of course, the location is in Hartford, Connecticut, and we're meeting at the Mark Twain Gallery. In a way, honoring Mark Twain, who was one of the early authorship doubters. And he was such a strong doubter that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote anything that he wrote an entire book Is Shakespeare Dead?" about the authorship question. He wrote this around 1910, 1905, somewhere around there. And he remained a strong doubter. He was not familiar with the Oxford theory because it hadn't been proposed yet. So we have Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and half a day Sunday. We have something like 15 different speakers. Some of them fairly well known. Hank Whittemore is going to speak on the pen name, and John Hamill, the president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, is going to give us some information about the results of our research grant program. You know, the fellowship makes small grants to scholars to investigate the authorship question. We've made at least a dozen or more. We have some scholars going through archives in Italy, and others visiting libraries and museums in England. Mark Anderson, author of Shakespeare by Another Name, a best-selling authorship book, is going to be speaking on Friday. Rick Wagaman will be speaking. Also, Tom Renee, our lawyer, speaking. His talk is titled "Kill All the Lawyers." Roger Strittmatter, probably the best-known authorship scholar, will be speaking on Saturday, and we'll be having a banquet on Sunday and giving different awards and so on. So the public is invited, and it's relatively easy to show up. I'm sure one can get in without paying anything for one or two of these days of talks, and someone can sign up for the full conference and pay the registration fee and be treated with lunch and dinner and banquet and so on. So it'll be our first conference in Connecticut. We've had conferences in Oakland and Toronto and Chicago and Minneapolis and Madison. We have one every year, and we'd like people to come and hear about the authorship question and hear the very interesting research into all aspects of this question. This is an enormous subject. There are 100 different alleys one can run down and find something significant to write about and to talk about.
Okay, well, and we'll have Alex McNeil on next Wednesday talking about Justice John Paul Stevens' interest in this subject and how he was trained to weigh all the evidence, and that's going to be an interesting discussion. So I'm looking forward to talking with Alex about that next Wednesday. But and if listeners want to know any more about the conference or what the fellowship is doing, they can go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, and all the information is there. So
that's right.
Yeah, and we're down to the last minute. So I just want to thank Steve for being a great first-hour guest, and Ramon, thank you for enlightening us on this subject. And best wishes for the conference. We'll see the listener, or you can tune in tomorrow night for Barbara and Mary doing their show, and we'll be back next Wednesday. So I just want to thank everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow night.